everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening here at the Ghost Furnace. It is me, Bond, with my good friend and cohort, Nick Pennsylvania. How are you doing tonight, Nick?
I am doing very good. I'm very well hydrated and prepared to chat.
Nice. So speaking of chatting, we have a few things for you guys this evening that we're excited about. The first thing we're going to look at is actually some feedback that we received from some listeners. And then I am going to tell Nick and you guys about a story that I heard recently. Well, let's say story. It's folklore that I came across recently that I've been super excited about and am really excited to share with you guys. And then we will probably be able to get to a topical or a timely topical article afterwards that Nick has only teased me with, but I am very excited about hearing. So Nick, you said we had some feedback to share.
Yeah, actually, you're aware of some of the feedback too, which is we'll talk about a little later because there's a person we're gonna try to finagle onto our conversation. But the Philip experiment episode, which was our previous episode, generated quite a bit of thoughts amongst people, and we always thank you for writing in. And these come from an Emily who wrote down her thoughts and put down that with regard to this whole Philip experiment, they think the experiment wasn't an ESP, extrasensory perception sort of experiment, but rather a social experiment to document society's reaction to all these occurrences. And almost like, is this like the televangelist sort of healing things? Do people believe in it? Was the theory after having seen it and after being told deliberately that it's a made-up story. This is like television shows which are clearly staged. And the first thing I thought of was James Randi touring like Australia and whatnot with a person they claimed was conjuring the spirit of a 2,000-year-old person that was making all these predictions and reading all these things. And they came out to the national press saying, no, this was all a fraud that we developed to kind of see how people would respond. And a lot of people, not the majority, but there were some ardent people who either because they were afraid that they had been so successfully fooled or because they truly believed it, continued to insist that the person who was channeling the spirit was legitimate, even though they have been very open about the whole thing being fraudulent. So anyway, the person wraps up by saying, I think the folks who conjured up the story of Philip sit around having coffee, minds blown over the fact that given the evidence, people still thought that they were not moving the table and they were actually communicating with a made-up character. So not a paranormal experience or experiment, but a sociological experiment. What do you think about that?
I mean, that's interesting. I think first off, you said those, Emily. Thank you very much for sending us that feedback. That's a really interesting take on it. I like the idea of it being a social experiment in some ways because it did come from psychologists. There were psychologists, working on this case. It would not be the first time a experiment was meant to look like one type of experiment when really they were testing other things. And I think it does say some interesting things about the quote unquote believers, like you said, especially with talking about people like James Randi and some of the things that he was able to do. I think generally people are uncomfortable when met with data or truth or whatever that is counter to their experience, especially if it is something they have put a lot of stock into and a lot of align their identity with. I think studying that is important psychological data. So if that is the case, it sounds like they did a good job either way.
Yeah, and I think the easy way to determine whether or not that is the case would be to go to whatever university this was associated with, and there should be some record of it released by this point.
Yeah, you would think so that there would be some kind of findings. So, but either way, very interesting thoughts, I think, and I'm not surprised that a number of folks had feedback on this case.
Yeah, it's I was thinking about those statements, and I thought that is interesting, and not outside of the realm of possibility, because we know of other similar experiments that have been conducted formally, or in the James Randi case, informally. So you told me that there is a story from West Virginia, as I recalled, and you said it was Wizard Cliffs. Am I right in that? And what is this all about? Because I have been very good and I didn't look up anything ahead of time.
Thank you. So I came across this story less than a week ago. So it's very fresh to me. I heard about it, was immediately fascinated with it, bought a book that had a small section on it, and did some other research, and then contacted you right after. So it's about a place that is technically called Middleway, West Virginia. And this takes place back in 1794. So it kind of feels like a Dr. PA episode, us going back that far.
Well, and it's pretty old for West Virginia standards, because, again, that area of back then, Virginia.
It would have been Virginia.
Would have been very sparsely inhabited, and we know this because, our Commonwealth declared war on Virginia around that time, because Virginia's sea-to-sea charter was laying claim to some of southwestern Pennsylvania as Virginia, and they were grandfathering. It's a whole story. I think we documented on Dr. PA. But again, this was the western fringe of European settlement at that time.
Yes, and it's not in West Virginia, the west side. It's actually, when you look at it on the map, it's southwest of like Lancaster, PA.
Okay.
It's like that far. It's like that far over. I'd say it's like directly south of maybe like Bedford, Pennsylvania.
Okay, so near Breezewood and everywhere.
Yeah. So it's a little
Breezewood, Hagerstown, Werfelsburg.
Yeah. So it's a little more east, but everything you just said still counts, as far as the environment and everything, and the types of places we're talking about. So I'm just going to get into the story, and we'll see where this takes us. Like I said, 1794, a stranger walks into town. We all love when the stories start like this. Stranger walks into town and stops a farmer's house, a farmer by the name of Adam Livingston. The stranger is not well and asks if he can stay at Adam Livingston's house. Back then, pretty sparsely populated even in that area. Travelers staying in farmhouses as compared to like inns or taverns or things like that was, pretty commonplace. And the guy did say that he was not well. Adam Livingston welcomed him in his house, got all set up with a room and everything. The next day, the guy gets even worse and is like, "Hey, I'm probably going to die. I need you to go into town and get a Catholic priest." This was a problem, however. Apparently, Adam Livingston, and in some of the records I found, on the nice end of things, was said to be not kindly disposed towards Catholics. On the other end, even a Catholic website says he was not enthusiastic about the faith.
Yeah, not an uncommon position either, because I know the town next to you, in fact, had an ordinance that there couldn't be any Catholic parish built within the town limits. And this is in ecumenical Pennsylvania.
Yes.
And so the one Catholic church against 5 Presbyterians is built in the old Hungarian section of town, which was actually not part of the town until it was annexed in the 1950s. So, interesting.
So not terribly uncommon. And I guess the quote in one of the places I found said that he knew of no priest in that neighborhood, and if there was one, he should never pass the threshold of this door. This Adam Livingston denied this guy last rites, basically, which, especially if you're a Catholic, that's kind of a big deal.
Yeah, it's one of the most important of the 7 sacraments.
Exactly. So either way, this guy then dies. This stranger. I can't no there's no record of this guy's name, just it says a robed stranger. He dies, and when he dies, apparently all the candles in the room go out. Adam Livingston, being a working farmer, uh buries this guy out in on his property. He has like some places say he had as little as 30 acres. Some things I saw said as much as 72 acres to his farm. So he had a decent sized farm. But so he ended up burying this stranger on the farm property without his quote unquote last rites. This is when things take an even stranger turn. The first thing that started to happen was candles would not stay lit in the house after this stranger died. Then right away we have poltergeist type activity. You have knocking, banging, scraping sounds just coming from all over the house. Specifically, they heard the sounds of horses running very often, but there was no horses running anywhere. On more than one occasion, sums of money would disappear. Then things kind of took a little bit of a violent turn. They started finding their chickens missing their heads in the chicken coop and all over the yard, apparently. Logs would fly out of the fire and on 2 occasions almost burn the house down. So pretty crazy poltergeist activity after this guy dies. The activity starts to permeate out from the house into the town, which is like southeast of the farmhouse. And when it starts to spread, this is the most interesting or just memorable part for me that I found. People would start to hear the sound of scissors clipping, like snip, 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 you know? And people would find pieces of fabric, clothing, drapes, anything that was fabric would have little moons, like crescent moons cut into them. Just randomly. You'd hear snip, 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 and there'd be these little moons. This got so bad and so prevalent that this has started happening all over the town. It got into the news, and people started coming from all over to like see about this, basically. People started calling the folks from this town clippers because of all the clipping that's going on. And it was all attributed to what they called this wizard, who they felt was this stranger who died at Adam Livingston's farm. There was a few famous accounts of newspapermen going there to write articles, having their clothes clipped. There was some socialite from a nearby town that went there with her hat and didn't want it to get clipped. So she put it like inside like a towel or something, and then inside a bag, and then inside her trunk. And still, when she got home, it had these crescent moons cut in it. Apparently, one of the newspapermen, while he was writing an article talking about how crazy it all was, had moon-shaped holes clipped into the inside of his pockets. This is happening, and after a while, everyone kind of puts 2 and 2 together and goes, I think this is an Adam Livingston problem, not giving this guy his last rites, yada yada, because they had both Presbyterian, Lutheran, Presbyterian and Lutheran churches, or excuse me, Presbyterian, Lutheran, and Methodist, like pastors and priests come out, and after them blessing the house, doing those kind of things, didn't help. And then Adam Livingston has a prophetic dream. And in this prophetic dream, a robed man says, "This is the man who can relieve you." And he recognized this man as Father Dennis Cahill from the nearby Catholic Church. So he eventually reaches out to the Catholic Church, asks for this Father Dennis Cahill, and the priest comes out, blesses the house, and apparently that stops all this poltergeist activity for a brief time It comes back and he does a full like mass in the house and apparently blesses like quote unquote the whole town. And at that point, the vast majority of the poltergeist activity stops, and the clipping is the only thing apparently that continues in as like an every once in a while type thing, apparently not nearly as prevalent. Now, after this happens, that's kind of the end of the story of Wizard Clip. um but there are some things that kind of happen afterwards that are kind of interesting. This gentleman Adam ends up donating his land to the church while he's still alive. Some sources make it seem like this was kind of a whether by the town or by the church, was very much a, hey, you should donate that land, wink wink nudge nudge kind of thing. Some people say he was kind of forced into it. However, it actually still is it still is part of the church. It's actually now known as the Priestfield Pastoral Center. It's like a garden and retreat area that welcomes all faiths, apparently. But they actually have a really nice website. It looks great. There's an awesome little trout stream that runs through the property. It seems like a really, really cool little place, actually. The town has kind of kept up with the whole Wizard Clip thing. A lot of their town signage has the little crescent moons on it and things like that. And people in the area are still called Clippers. The thing that's kind of interesting to me afterwards that makes me think that maybe he wasn't coerced into donating this land is I couldn't find much information on this element of it because I wasn't buying any of these old books. There's a ton of books published around the time of this about this happening. And apparently this voice that came to him in a dream stayed with him for the next 17 years and would give him guiding advice about the Catholic faith, kind of guide him, which on the church websites that I found was really referred to as like, not like a miracle, but it was something that the church definitely took very seriously afterwards. Unfortunately, I couldn't find a lot of specific documentation on it. But it sounds like this guy, by all records that I could find, did a 180 from being very anti-Catholic to being very, very, very Catholic. But the most important thing I think here is the stranger was given his last rites. He has a proper burial, has a cross on it now and everything. The only remnants are a very nice church retreat center, and you still have people to this day apparently that will hear this little snip 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 and find half moons cut into their garments. So
well,
what do you think about that, Nick? What do you think
I
about
can't
that?
believe I've never heard that story, one. And I have to admit, for whatever reason, when you first called me, I thought you said Wizard Cliffs.
Well, it might have been my excitement.
It may have been a bad phone connection.
Yeah.
But even now, I swear, when I introduced this and handed over the mic to you, I did say Wizard Cliffs. So I'm a little embarrassed. I'm definitely going to have to check this out. This is what a great story. It reminds me in part, do you recall the Dream of the Lost Children?
Not off the top of my head, no.
This was an earlier Dr. Pennsylvania we had done.
Oh, yes.
No, this is just a little north of this area in Bedford County, PA. Yeah, and definitely we will talk about that at a future time. But a neighbor, basically the quick story is a couple boys lost in the woods during a bad snowstorm. A neighbor from a mountainside on the other side of the mountain or something to that effect has a dream about where the boys are located, and the dream leads them to the boys. I believe, though, that they were already gone, unfortunately. But it came to him in a dream. So pretty wild stuff. Makes me think about this a little bit. But the physical snipping of things I find is interesting, too. And as far as wizards and Catholicism, I would remind that in this region here, we do have a long tradition, especially in the Deitch community. Well, not the not the Amish Deitch because they're not Catholic, but the German community here of the powwows and the Brockers,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
who that the
It's very close. Yeah.
right and the I guess the focal text of that Der Begotten Front, it was written by a German Catholic mystic of sorts
Mm-hmm.
in Pennsylvania. So yeah, it's not without those sort of figures, but that's such an interesting thing in the lengths that one woman went with regard to her hat sound
Right.
hilarious to me.
Yeah. I just think it's interesting. And like I said, there was a bunch of like books. When I say books, I really mean like pamphlets at the time written about this. And by all accounts that I could find, there wasn't anyone saying like, "Oh, this is a hoax," or "Oh, I wonder what's happening." Like it seemed like everyone was like, "No, this is all happening," and it was documented by lots of, reputable folks at the time, which I think is interesting. And it kind of reminds me, I mean, this was obviously probably 30, 40 years earlier, but I think this kind of has some parallels to the Bell Witch, where you
Funny
have the
enough, I thought
vengeful
about
spirit.
that.
Yeah.
I thought about it because I was thinking of the movie. And I
Mm-hmm.
think the movie took a really interesting twist with that whole story. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think there's some Bell Witch parallels. You have the idea of a vengeful spirit, and it's interesting, I think, how you have this guy doing this 180, whether it is out of self-preservation or out of, like, regardless of his motivations, like, to go from being being known as not enthusiastic about Catholics, to donating land.
Yeah. A regular
That's
old anti papist.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, which again wasn't unusual at the time. Like, I think it's interesting. Like that kind of tells me that like something happened. There was something going on with the poltergeist activity. Again, we're using poltergeist as like a placeholder for just this type of phenomena. I just love vengeful spirit stories, and the fact that this one was so petty to destroy people's clothes by clipping half moons into them is just such like a specific detail that I've never heard anywhere else in any other story when it comes to this type of phenomena. And like, have you ever heard of anything like that, Nick?
I mean, there's all sorts of stories about, I mean, because what's the one thing that everybody used to always say about ghosts is people had things that they had left to do or unsettled things. And the vengeful spirit thing, I think, is a really common thing. The singularity in how this one expressed itself is interesting with the crescent moon snips. I think if you go back to a lot of old folklore regarding witches in eastern United States, I think you'll see these sorts of stories much more associated with them, and that this person was a wizard of some sort, or the claim goes, suggests to me that either the stories were common enough that they were drawing their own parallels and concluded that must have been some sort of wizard or something like that because, well, this is what happens with witches all the time. I think there's something to that, perhaps, because there was nothing in the story prior to the man passing away that indicated that that was his vocation.
Correct. I think that's a really good way of putting it. That like when this stuff started to happen after this guy had died, that's the conclusion that lots of people kind of went to. And we do talk a lot about how, local culture plays into these things. And that might be a really good little window into how these people interpreted this type of phenomena. Go, oh, you're having A, B, and C happen, must be a
That's
witch.
a witch.
And in this case, it's a wizard, kind of thing.
Which is just, yeah, the same sort of position. It reminds me before we started talking today about predictive capability. And so, yeah, here are the symptoms. Therefore, it's most likely this is what's causing it. And you even brought up the Bell Witch, and I'm thinking about, say, the River Witch, and there's a bunch of witch stories where, again, it's either after the witch has passed, or it's a curse, a hex that they put on, but a very similar thing. So yeah, bottom line though, a supremely interesting story that I was embarrassingly enough not aware of.
No, but it's okay because I had never, if I had ever heard it before, it was just in passing and I didn't internalize it, because whenever I just heard the story recently, I was just giddy. I was so excited listening to it because I just think that like this is such a good example of like kind of, for lack of a better term, a fun element that like you don't get very often. And this one also has the benefit of like actually having I guess what you call a happy ending, in the sense that like everyone was better off afterwards. It's not like Adam Livingston killed the guy. The guy just, was obviously ill. He got his proper burial. Everyone kind of wins in the end, except for everyone who had their clothes ruined.
Right, and that is a much bigger deal when off the rack purchases weren't yet the norm.
Exactly. So I'm really glad you enjoyed that story, because
I sure did.
I was all about it.
Now, on the subject of stories, I did tease you a little bit with a headline, which was, and again, this came out 2 days prior to us recording this. So I was going to say I'm disappointed that our friend Brian could not be here with us, but we're looking to record with him the very next episode we have. So if there are any updates to this story, we are going to be sure to bring them up with Brian, because this is a Bigfoot story, which means Bond and Brian. The headline was, and I'm getting this from an NBC news outlet, Oklahoma man accused of killing fishermen out of fear of being eaten by Bigfoot, authorities say. Another headline, which I believe, man who allegedly killed friend while fishing claims Bigfoot influenced him. Bigfluence, whatever. So I'm just going to read a little bit about this, but this is from July 13th, 2022, 4:04 p.m. An Oklahoma man confessed to killing a fellow fisherman out of fear he'd been left alone in a wilderness to be eaten by Bigfoot, authorities said. Larry Doyle Sanders, 53, made the bizarre confession to two special agents with the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation on Sunday as they probed the death of Jimmy Glenn Knighton, according to an arrest affidavit for suspicion of first-degree murder. Sanders and Knighton had gone noodling in the South Canadian River the previous day, Sanders said, and the two men had gotten into a physical altercation, according to the affidavit. The quote says, Larry, that while at the river, discovered Jimmy intended to feed him to Sasquatch/Bigfoot. This is in the affidavit. Further, Larry indicated Jimmy attempted to get away from him so that the Sasquatch could eat Larry. Larry would not let Jimmy get away. Larry punched Jimmy and struck Jimmy with a stick. Larry and Jimmy fought for an extended amount of time on the ground. Larry confirmed he killed Jimmy by choking him to death near the river. Sanders drew a map and shared details where investigators could find Knighton's body, and a male's body was found Sunday. That is believed to be of Knighton, the affidavit said. So it's unclear Wednesday whether Sanders had retained a lawyer or representative of Pontotoc County Jail said Sanders remained. There is no bond on a charge of first-degree murder. Relatives of Sanders and Knighton could not be reached. There's more to the story, but that is the gist of it. So you have to wonder, was this a joke that went bad? Was this two well-aged men that are in mortal fear of Bigfoot/Sasquatch? What's going on? What's your initial impression? Do you think this is just a terrible, terrible, like, I have to have some motivation other than what my real motivation is story? It sounds sad.
It sounds really sad. Like, obviously, like, a man lost his life. That's awful under, any circumstances. but the fact that this other accused guy put it in an affidavit makes me think of one of two options. Well, one of two realistic options. Option one is that the guy is mentally ill, honestly believes that, and is probably in need of some serious psychiatric help. I'd say more likely it's a case where the guy needs to say something because he can't say what his actual motivation is. So he's just being flippant with the police about it and coming up with something.
Or it was the first thing that came to mind.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Because it really is sad. But it also does make you kind of worry that like what if the guy actually believed that? If he was mentally ill and honestly believed that this other guy was leaving him out there for Bigfoot/Sasquatch to be eaten. Like obviously there have been some things that have failed him on the way. From
I want to know
standpoint.
How was he leaving him there? Was he just going to drive off without him, or was he like trying to tie him to a tree like that goat in Jurassic Park?
There's obviously more to the story here. And
the thing is, I brought it up because I was scrolling through the news and that headline popped out at me. And I said, well, I think we need to document this because it was only earlier this week, too, that you had seen something about a supposed skull being found. And then it was pretty quickly just debunked. Not unlike I remember back at around 05, 06, there was a hunter in Texas who claimed to have killed one and kept it in a freezer, and it was pretty quickly dismissed as well.
Yeah, from what, like I said, I haven't actually read any of the articles at the time or the rebuttals, but there's basically some guy who was, a supposed cryptozoologist, had these photos and made these posts about him finding this skull in the woods, and it was just like a very plainly staged. The post had many references to before the government takes down these pictures, yada yada. When stuff like that happens, I think it's good for people that are into the paranormal community to actually pay attention, because when those things happen, you see what outlets and what kind of like quote unquote sources run with it and which ones don't. And then it came out a few days later that like it was just a ploy to drive traffic to the guy's YouTube channel. It's like, well, of course. Like, of course
I'm sure it worked.
Yeah, I'm sure it did. In his defense, it worked,
And maybe that's something we ought to do because, again, we post these on quite a few different services, one of which is YouTube. It's just another way for us to be out there.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to help us increase our numbers, how can you write us clever ploys that we can get some media attention? Where would you write to us with your charlatanry?
Charlatanry? Yeah.
Charlatanry.
Charlatanry. Yeah, if you have stories, ideas, thoughts, comments, feedback, anything. Schemes. Yeah, we're into schemes. You can reach out to us like Nick just mentioned on YouTube, Facebook, or Instagram, or on all those platforms. Additionally, you can just email us at theghostfurnacepodcast@gmail.com.